Hello, and welcome to the Kreel Manor playthrough overview video. So what you're seeing here is the setup of the game for a Wolf of the North character who's basically the warrior class for Kreel Manor. This setup may be very familiar to those of you who've played Veilwraith, although there's a few new touches in here. For a start, the addition of colour, and Kreel Manor is effectively the first in the timeline of Kilforth games. So this goes right back to the beginning of the story of Gloom of Kilforth, for example. Kreel Manor is set in an age gone by, an age of powerful heroes with incredible abilities, and you are taking on the role of the heroes tasked with finding out and investigating the strange goings on in Kreel Manor, where the Lord of the Manor is actually trying to open a hole in the veil to the other side. He's trying to open a portal to a dimension, a hellish dimension filled with demons, and unleash a toxic gloom upon the world of Kilforth. So chronologically speaking, this takes place before Gloom of Kilforth. This gives you the opportunity to stop the gloom from ever entering the world of Kilforth. If you can go and descend into the dungeons of Kreel Manor and destroy the Lord of the Manor and stop the gloom from spreading from its source. But to do that, you're going to have to travel through a series of dungeons, and here we are entering the Moon Chapel with our Wolf of the North character. All the hero boards will be two-sided, so you can flip this over for alternative artwork. Now, a word about the presentation here. So this is very obviously a prototype made from components printed on my computer at home. So if you ever wondered how a two-person team can make their games look like $1 million, this is one of the areas where I save costs, is when I'm experimenting and putting the scenarios together. So yeah, obviously the final game will be as beautiful as Gloom of Kilforth and all of our other games. And there's a few component swaps here. So we've got the spirit dial from Veilwraith. This will be its own Kreel Manor themed spirit dial, and you'll probably recognise some of these components if you've played any of our Kilforth games. So ostensibly what's happening here is we are the Wolf of the North, and we're heading into Kreel Manor in search of our objective. In this case, it's the Moon Chapel. We'll travel through a series of locations to get to it, and we'll be overcoming threats every round, and these threats are going to come out of the shadows and assail us, and we're going to have to interact with them either by fighting, talking using our influence, or intimidating them, or sneaking past, or backstabbing them. So we've got different approaches we can take every round to deal with the threats that come out of the threat deck. But essentially, rounds play very quickly and simply. The depth of the gameplay comes from the cards themselves and your management of your different actions. So I'm just going to show you how that works quickly. So at the start of the game, we'll be set up something like this, and we have a threat deck here, and we're looking through this threat deck for a number of objective cards. Now, objectives or plots are new to Kreel Manor. If you played Veilwraith, you would have been looking through the threat deck for 5 keys. The keys of hope and light and love, and those keys were the same 5 keys every game. Well, in Kreel Manor, the plots and objectives will vary for each scenario. So what happens now is the way we build the deck of threats for each scenario, it's going to be thematically, or is thematically linked together. So for example, we have in here a Goblin Mudrunner threat group. So that's 6 cards that are all Goblin themed. There'll be Goblin Mudrunners, for example, which are like the main sort of Goblin fighters, but there'll also be Goblin themed objectives and events and stuff. We build the threat deck using 5 different groups, and that could be Goblin, Barbarian, Undead, Manor. They're all different sort of thematically linked groups that you'll stitch together for each scenario, and it also allows you to make your own scenarios very easily. So after you've completed all the content in the base game, which is going to take you ages to be honest, because the base game comes with 10 scenarios, but you play through them differently each time using different heroes. So the Wolf of the North has his own fixed 3 scenarios. Everyone shares the same introduction and the same finale scenario to fight the Lord of the Manor. But the way that you go about getting there will be different each time. So if you played each character solo, for example, and you played them through to completion of each campaign, that would be 5 scenarios per character. So you could play that 15 different ways in the base game. And then you can set up these endless dungeons, we call them, where you put the different threats groups together based on their difficulty level to create your own ongoing scenarios. So a huge amount of variety and variability in the setup of these scenarios in the base game, And also, obviously, if you followed our games before, I would love to do expansion content for this, more characters, new scenarios, new threats and everything, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, so we'll try and rein that back a little bit. So new elements here, obviously colour, we've got full, beautifully illustrated, full colour cards. Jose Del Nido taking the lead art on the characters again, and we now have assets, so it wouldn't be a dungeon crawler without loot. So in this, each time you defeat an objective, you're going to be able to draw assets or gain new skills and upgrade your character as you go to become more powerful. And you're going to need to become more powerful to be able to take on the higher scenarios and the more difficult threats that emerge. So at the start of a round, this is your gameplay area will look something like this. And what's going to happen is one of these threats is going to come out of the shadows down into our threat area, which means we have to then deal with it. So here we have a goblin mudrunner. And when we do that, we're going to push all these threats along and they're going to fill up. So the shadows is another new area you can interact with. This allows characters like the rogue, which we're not playing today, but the rogue gets to sneak into the shadows and fire his bow into the shadows, and there will be ways to target these elements that are hiding in the dark and looking for you. So anyway, here we have a goblin mudrunner, and he has 2 fight and 4 influence. Now if we look at our abilities here, we have 1 fight and 2 influence, so we're a way off being able to tackle him at the moment, but there are a number of ways we can try and overcome him. If we wanted to influence him, for example, we have 2 influence and he has 4. So we're not in a good position at the moment, but what we can do, each round you're going to use 1 action, and there's a number of ways to use the actions. You can directly attack a threat with him. So if I was to try and influence him with 2 influence, I would simply put 2 influence tokens on there and show that negotiations have begun. He has 4, so that's not going to defeat him this round, but it does mean that we've started a conversation. Maybe I'm intimidating him or bullying him or negotiating eloquently with him. That's all down to your interpretation. But for gameplay purposes, it essentially means we put 2 damage onto him. So again, this is different from Veilwraith. You have accumulated ongoing damage. You don't have to deal with a threat all in one go. It might take a number of rounds. Another option we can use is to use a card. Instead of attacking a threat and trying to do damage to it, we can use an action in the same way by tiring it to draw a skill from our skill deck. And we're going to be getting one of these at the start of each round. We'll come back to these in a second. So we could draw a new card into our hand, or we can tilt an action, which just means you turn it ever so slightly and stick a power token on there. And that means you can't use that action this round, but next turn when we use it, we'll be able to rotate it completely and spend this power token to add to our existing power in that ability. So you can tilt, you can use them to draw, or you can use them to deal with threats. And there are other cards and abilities in here that will help you deal with threats as well. When you use an action, whether it's to deal with a threat or to draw a card, when you tire it completely, you'll push it to the start of the track, your action power track here, and that will push your other actions up and along. And so you can see you sort of negotiating with different powers here. So our influence would be down to 1 if we did that. If we'd have sneaked, we could use our sneak, for example. One of the things you can use sneak for is to look into the shadows. So we could spend 3 sneak, it costs 3 to look at this shadow, 2 to look at this shadow, 1 to look at this one. We'd be spending 3 sneak and we could flip one of these over, and that would push our sneak down to the bottom of the track. So then our influence would be much higher. If we were to do that and have a peek at him, we could then tilt our influence and increase that to 4, and then we know that next round we're in a good position to be able to tackle this goblin mudrunner. We just reset that again. Another option we have here is our Wolf of the North is currently carrying a longsword, which is a new asset card, new to Kreel Manor, so you'll be able to get loot and treasure and stuff like that. And we can see here it's linked to the fist slot on this character sheet, so we could put it in either hand slot here. If it was a backpack item or footwear, armor or helmet, we'd be putting it in a different slot. So you'd be building this cool sort of character as you progress through the game. So we do have an asset here called the longsword, and we could use that once per round to gain a fight power token. So if I was to just use that and stick a token on there, we could transfer it to the fight ability there. And now that gives us 2 fight, which is actually enough to take on this Goblin Mudrunner. That has 2 uses. So we'd park a token on there to show that it's been used once. And once we use it again, that would be used for this scenario, and you refresh it for the next scenario. So once a threat has revealed itself from the shadows at the start of the round, you will draw a skill card from your skill deck here. And we are going to be able to use these to help us tackle incoming threats. Now, some of them will be generic skills that all heroes have access to, and some of them will be particular to your character class. So if you're a Wolf of the North, you'll be using blade-based skills with the Path of the Blade, and they'll be combat-focused and thematic to that particular character. The Wizard will have spells they can cast. The Rogue has arrows you can fire into the shadows and things like that. We'll be drawing one of these each round and pulling it into our hand to deal with threats as they arrive. So if we use this longsword to give ourselves a fight token here, we've now got 2 fight. The Goblin's only got 2 fight. So if we use this ability, spend a power token, that gives us 2 power, we will defeat this Goblin. And his special ability is when he's defeated, remove him from the game. Normally they go into the threat discard pile, which means they can potentially come back around. That guy is removed from the game for good. If we'd have used influence, for example, that would have pushed our fight up, but because our fight was already in the lowest slot, it stays where it is. And we can still tilt one of these to power it up. So let's go ahead and give our influence 1 power token. And that's it. So we've done 1 action, 1 tilt. We've used our longsword, so we're going to pop a token on there to show it's got 2 uses. We've got 1 left for the rest of the scenario. And then we're going to simply reset and go again. And it's a new round. So the next threat is going to emerge from the shadows. And here we have a living corpse. So this guy's a little trickier to deal with. He has 5 influence and 5 fight. So we're not anywhere near tackling this dude at the moment. The living corpse here has a fell stench ability. So when he's played, we lose 2 spirit. If our spirit ever gets to 0, we are wounded, which means we lose the scenario. So in Veilwraith, you would have lost a silver ribbon. In Kreel Manor, you'll take a wound card. So for example, if he'd taken our last spirit and defeated us, we would draw one of these, and here we have a splintered arm. We can only carry 1 hand asset. So if we'd had another hand asset here, we'd have had to drop it. And if you get too many wounds, you will lose the campaign. As we are searching through all these threats, what we're looking for is plot cards. So at the end of each round, we're going to draw a new threat, and here we have our first plot card. So it has a number of ways to interact with it. If we do defeat it, we get to choose how we interact with it, whether we're going to, this is a haunted statue, for example. We can choose to purify, smash, or pray at this haunted statue. Our choice is going to have an impact, so we're going to draw a story card, which would then be potentially shuffled into the next scenario, but it will have ongoing repercussions that we need to deal with. So to complete a scenario, we need to defeat 5 of these objectives. And each time we defeat one, we're going to gain a little level up. It could be a new skill, it could be an asset that we can add. So here we've got a leather buckler, which will give us a new ability. We can have that in our other hand. When we defeat all 5 objectives, there's going to be a foe that we have to defeat as well, or a number of foes, which will be unique to each scenario. Here we have a werewolf, for example, and we're going to have to defeat that in order to win the scenario and move on to the next one. And obviously the scenarios will step up in difficulty each time. And so that's a quick overview. So obviously it plays very simply. You're drawing a threat, you're drawing a skill, then you're interacting with them, you're powering up one of your actions every round, you're exploring locations as you go. So not only are you interacting with threats, you'll be trying to sneak and explore these different locations by putting damage tokens on here, and if you reach the explore value of a location, you defeat that and move on to the next one, which might have a different effect as well. So there's loads of ways to interact with it. And we also have story cards. So each character has their own story as they go into Kreel Manor. The Wolf of the North, for example, is looking for their friend Warsig, who disappeared into Kreel Manor. So over the course of the game, you'll be looking to try and find him and rescue him. That might be freeing him from a cell or discovering his weapons. It might even be enlisting him in a final battle against certain foes. So each character has their own story path that they'll be travelling whilst they're overcoming these threats, looking for objectives and fighting against the foe. That's the game in a nutshell. There's obviously a lot more to it, but I don't want to bamboozle you with information. There are playthroughs of Veilwraith, the full game. There's loads of playthroughs of Veilwraith on the Kickstarter page itself. I'm not going to do a full playthrough of Kreel Manor because we often are accused of revealing too much information, and there's very much a case of when a game arrives, you know how to play through the first scenario, for example, you know how to defeat it in that. So as much as possible, we want this to be a surprise and you witness it for the first time. Even seeing the cards coming out is a bit of a spoiler. Some of this is subject to change still. We're finalising everything, including the components and the graphic design and the artwork and everything. So that's the game in a nutshell. Thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see you on the Kickstarter page.